Hi, welcome to class today. I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State, and the course is Ethics and Values. Today we're going to move to the virtue ethic, and to talk about this ethic we've got Dr. Michael Shaw, and he is an assistant professor in the philosophy department at UVSC, and this is your specialty, ancient philosophy. So Michael, tell me how you got interested in it and about your background and dissertation and some of the fun things you've done.
My interest just began with an undergraduate course in college where I took ancient philosophy. It was one of the first classes I took after I decided to major in philosophy, and except for me, all the students in the class thought it was like the hardest class they'd taken in college so far, and to me it came reasonably naturally, and I found many other classes far more challenging.
Can I ask you a question at this point? A lot of students tell me that once they understand the ancient Greeks, they understand Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they kind of feel like they're part of the club. That it's been these old texts that are kind of unapproachable. They're supposed to be so hard. But once they're finished with the Ethics and Values class, they usually have at least a well-educated person's grasp of the philosophers.
Yeah, I think that's true, and that the ideas that these philosophers develop in their thought are carried through the history of Western philosophy, so that a great majority of the ideas that contemporary philosophers talk about are developed in Plato and Aristotle. Not to say that the answers or the solutions or decisions about these problems stay the same, but what the questions are, what the important problems for human beings to deal with are all in these texts, and there's very little addition to them from that perspective over the history of the last 2,000, 2,500 years.
Okay, well, before we hear the rest about you, or a little bit more, I'd like to introduce our students who are here with us today. We have Rhonda and Luke. Thank you for coming today. And over here we have Lloyd and Aaron. And I think that you will find they're very well prepared and ready for a good discussion. But tell us a little bit more about your background, Michael.
Well, when I went to graduate school, I began working on ancient philosophy primarily. What drew me to it was probably just the complexity and density of the writing, but also the literary mastery that Plato and even in a certain way Aristotle have. So the arguments were so pure and the texts were so puzzling and yet seemed to have these solutions. I found it very exciting. And at the same time, I do have the feeling that it is, in my opinion, the best philosophy that's been done to this date. And so that's one of the real reasons that I was attracted to what I saw as almost the pinnacle of Western thought at its very inception.
Okay.
And then in terms of my own work, I wrote my dissertation on Aristotle's theoretical philosophy. So we're working on Aristotle's ethics, which is part of his practical philosophy.
And you focused on desire, is that correct?
I did. I looked at the question of desire in his theoretical philosophy, so not a conscious human or even unconscious animal desire, but almost a cosmic force that seems to permeate Aristotle's universe that is not well developed in the history of the commentaries.
Okay, and if you could just tell us a little bit more about the virtue ethic and about teleology.
Well, as we'll see when we move into the text, teleology is announced at the outset of this work on ethics. So teleology comes from the Greek word telos or telos, that means end, goal, purpose. And so teleology is basically a goal or purpose-driven activity. So most things that human beings do, anything that has a goal is a teleological activity. For Aristotle, all of nature is teleological, almost without exception. And all human activities are teleological as well. So Aristotle looks at human life as being teleological, which is to say that human life has a definitive purpose, and one for Aristotle that can be accomplished in this life itself. It's not that there's a purpose in another world or an afterlife, but there's a best way to live, and that's what Aristotle's after. Virtue ethics, as it relates to teleology, Aristotle will determine that acquiring certain virtues is the purpose of life. Is the highest telos, the highest goal of human life is to acquire these virtues. And then the other thing to keep in mind at the outset of a discussion of virtue ethics in Aristotle is that virtue ethics means that the human soul acquires develop certain characteristics, and that's what it means to be ethical. It's not necessarily, Aristotle doesn't think of it in the same way that we do. It's not to take the right position on an issue, although that will result from Aristotle's ethics, as much as it is to organize your soul in a precise way that will cause you to make the right decisions in life and to acquire the right goods that will bring you happiness and that will help your society the most. And so it's actually about, as we'll see, habituating your soul so that your own character just has these almost transforms these virtues into instinct, and they just come naturally from you.
Okay, and so this is very complex that you've just talked about, and some of our students may need to rewind the tape or back up on the DVD and watch it a few times, but you students here in the studio are representing the students who are watching it. Do you have some questions for Michael on any of these comments? Nope. None? Well, let's talk just a little bit about Aristotle's background. And which of you students would like to help me out with that? Do you want to tell me interesting things about his background? Okay.
I'll say one thing, just to steal one of your favorite phrases. Aristotle was a true interdisciplinarian. And I mean, this, from science, biology, I mean, he studied everything. And one thing that's kind of interesting, a lot of times as I've read Aristotle, at least when I first started reading Aristotle, a lot of times I felt like, well, I already knew this already. Like, this is so obvious. Why is he saying this? And I finally realized the reason it's so obvious to me is because the way that we see the world is so influenced by Aristotle's thought that for when he was thinking these things, they were revolutionary and were really new, interesting ideas. But a lot of our society has taken those in so much that a lot of it seems obvious, whereas it was new to him. And the reason it's obvious is because we're influenced by his thought.
That's a great point, because he even had a zoo. He had his own zoo, and so was a great biologist. You know, he was such an interdisciplinarian and such a prolific author. I've heard rumors that maybe all the writings aren't his. What do you think about that?
I think that if you look at a collected work of Aristotle, you'll see that many writings are considered to be spurious. Some, in the standard edition, you get 1 asterisk if it is possibly spurious, and 2 if it's almost certainly spurious. And most of the spurious works are probably not written by Aristotle, and that's maybe just a rough estimate, 1/4 to 1/3 of the existing corpus. The other 75+% or whatever the numbers would work out to are almost certainly written by Aristotle. So the ones that are not authentic have been identified by scholars as such, and we'll never be sure, but.
And we know that we don't have his original writings, but do we have, the work that we have now would be from his students and their taking of notes of his lectures?
It's a great question, and when we're dealing with Aristotle, who was born in 384 BC, it's hard to say for sure. We know that he published works in his lifetime. They were probably similar to Plato's dialogues. They were written for mass consumption. They were written or in the dialogue form. What we have of his are none of his published works. Those were all completely lost with the exception of very, very brief fragments. What we have are possibly lecture notes taken by his students. I believe they're probably lecture notes that he wrote himself to deliver to his students. Whatever they were not for public consumption, but they were really only for the initiates of his school, people who had a great familiarity with his work and probably with Plato's as well. Ultimately, they were preserved through the Islamic world, through what was most of the Western Middle Ages, when Aristotle was lost from 200 AD, give or take, or BCE. What do we use?
BCE.
Sorry, students. So they were lost from approximately 200 CE, or Common Era, till about 1000 or 1100 CE. And they ultimately worked their way back up to Europe by coming from Morocco into Spain. And that's when Thomas Aquinas and Thomas Aquinas' teachers got their hands on Aristotle, and it was returned to the West. But to answer your question directly, I think he wrote them.
Okay, and in a very strict form. Another funny thing about it, sometimes my students will think that, well, you've got a mistake on his date, having him being born in in 384 and dying in 322. And it's like, no, we're going this way toward time.
The BCE or before the Common Era goes backwards.
Yes. Okay, Rhonda.
So much of Aristotle's writings have been suggested that they were Plato's, and that as his student, Aristotle, as the student of Plato, wrote down so much of Plato's work. Is that true, or?
Again, I don't want to be absolute with anything with these texts that are so ancient, whose history is not perfectly preserved for us. But probably not. What you're probably hearing about is that Aristotle often engaged in problems that Plato would raise. And so we can trace, for example, a certain ethical dilemma, and we can trace that to a Platonic dialogue, and then we can see Aristotle working out almost exactly the same problem using very similar terms. Aristotle will usually critique Plato's solution and propose an alternative one, not inevitably. Sometimes he will agree with Plato, but on most of the big issues he'll say Plato was on the right track, but here are his mistakes and here's the better solution.
Thank you.
And so it's probably more the case that he's criticizing Plato's work than writing it or copying it or something like that.
And Erin, did you have a comment as well?
Oh, as far as Aristotle's background, I like history a lot, and so it was always interesting to me where Aristotle kind of came from in Macedonia, which was northern Greece, and his father was the physician to a royal physician, and then Aristotle was the tutor for Alexander the Great. And when you brought up the zoo, that just kind of clicked in my head, because I've heard kind of stories that Alexander would send things back to Aristotle so that he could develop this zoo like an elephant, and they didn't know what to feed it, and so the elephant unfortunately expires, but then Aristotle takes the opportunity to dissect it. You know, that kind of interesting thing, and Lloyd's bringing up the interdisciplinary aspect of that. He just was always looking for a way to learn something.
Having friends in high places is an amazing thing, isn't it?
It's a good ally.
Let's look at this for just a minute, the comments from Erin, because if we go back even further, we'll find then that we have Socrates, who's often seen as the father of Western philosophy, and Socrates' top student is Plato, and that's probably another area where you might have been thinking, Rhonda, because we have Plato writing down the Socratic dialogues, writing down Socrates' works.
That's true. That's a very good point. You may have been thinking about Plato writing down Socratic conversations, which is much more the way you described it. The relationship between Plato and Socrates can look like Plato was just simply copying down exactly what Socrates said, or copying down these conversations that Socrates had, and that was all he did. Probably Plato is using Socratic conversations as the basis for his dialogues, but it's probably not a historical record of what Socrates actually said, at least, except for a piece from this conversation, a piece from that conversation at best.
Right,
taken.
I just wanted to make sure that we had our philosophers in order.
Yes.
And quite often my students will also say, well, did anyone else have to die in the name of philosophy, in the name of truth, other than Socrates when he had to take the hemlock? And the answer is no, but Aristotle came pretty close, but he had friends in high places. You want to tell us about this relationship with Alexander and how he kind of saved his bacon?
Yes. Alexander was certainly a very powerful ally. And while Alexander was alive, Aristotle was quite safe almost anywhere in the Greek world, at least that was under Alexander's control. But when Alexander died in his campaign, that was when Alexander's political enemies started to take revenge against Alexander's supporters. And so Aristotle, who had been protected from any kind of political or religious persecution for his beliefs, upon the death of Alexander, had to flee Athens because he would have been tried and perhaps would have been found guilty of the same crimes that Socrates was found guilty of, corrupting the young, teaching false gods, however you want to look at those criticisms. And Aristotle fled into exile and died a year later. So Alexander did protect him, but then once Alexander died, that protection was gone and Aristotle was forced to flee. Socrates felt that leaving the city would be a crime against his ethic. And so he stayed, he faced trial, and he died, and he said that I am not being punished by my Athenian accusers because I have lived justly. And he very famously said, it is actually you Athenians who are going to be punished for this unjust action. You are the ones who will be harmed by your execution of me. I can't be harmed because I've done nothing wrong. Aristotle took it a little differently and said, maybe they could harm me. And so he got out of there.
But he wasn't home anyway. That was kind of.
I was skipping over that, but you're exactly right. Aristotle was not born and raised in Athens, and if you read, for example, the Apology or the Credo, Platonic dialogues that describe Socrates' execution and trial, Socrates will say he was raised in Athens, he never left Athens, and that's why that's one of the reasons why he shouldn't flee. Aristotle was born north of Athens, and he fled back to his home region when he left Athens. So he was not raised by the city the same way Socrates was. There were some different situations, but I suspect Socrates would have still said, no, Aristotle.
There are so many fascinating things about the lives of these three philosophers, and it was hard to just pin it down to discussing Aristotle. Tell us a little bit about this reading that we're going to go through right now, Michael.
Okay, well, this is our reading for today are selections from the first two books of the Nicomachean Ethics.
And where does this come from?
The Ethics?
The Nicomachean Ethics. I was going at his father and his son.
The name of the treatise comes from his father and his son, both of which are named Nicomachus. It's possibly the case, I suppose we should say, that it's called the Nicomachean Ethics because Aristotle's son collected the work into a single treatise after he died. Maybe Aristotle or some later scribe named it after Nicomachus, or maybe Nicomachus named it after himself, or more likely it just became called that because Nicomachus, after the death of Aristotle, collected the works. So what we have in the Nicomachean Ethics is a single treatise, but it's written in 10 books, or we might think of them as 10 chapters, but each book is subdivided into chapters. So we say that you'll have 10 chapters, or I believe the first book has 13 chapters, and then the second book has a certain number of chapters, and each one discusses a similar theme, but with slight differences between them. The first book that we're looking at is going to seek the highest good that a human being can acquire. The second book is going to look into Aristotle's conception of what he calls moral virtue, and then the book's topics develop as they go on. Possibly these were written as a single treatise. Probably these are several different ethical treatises that were collected together and we look at as a single book, but Aristotle may have written as 10 different books or 3 different books that have been collected. We'll never know, I don't think, for certain.
Okay, well, let's go ahead then and start looking at these major points that he brings up. And Luke, could you read for us our first graphic?
Yes. Every art or applied science and every systematic investigation, and similarly every action and choice, seem to aim at some good. The good, therefore, has been well defined as that at which all things aim. But it is clear that there is a difference in the ends at which they aim. In some cases, the activity is the end. In others, the end is some product beyond the activity. In cases where the end lies beyond the action, the product is naturally superior to the activity.
Okay, Aaron, do you want to tell us a little bit about your take on this very important introductory quote?
I think what Aristotle's trying to lay out, just as an introduction, as this primary point, is that when we do something, we usually have a purpose behind it. There's something we want to get from that. And so he's saying that every action that we take, if our purpose is to get something at the end of that, the end product, that's the word he's using, I think, the product, is more important than the action itself. So that if we're making choices to do something, to get something at the end, then the end thing is what we want, not the choice.
That's an A answer, it really is. Michael, what would you like to add to that?
Very little. It was a very good answer. The only thing that I have to add to what Aaron said, at least at this point, is that although he doesn't use the term here, this is a perfect description of what teleology is. Just that first sentence, every art and applied science, every action and pursuit is thought to aim at some good. That idea that everything we do aims at a good, that's teleology. The action itself is for the purpose of achieving the goal. And so the goal somehow pre-exists the activity, calls the activity into existence, and for Aristotle it will be what he will call the final cause. One of the primary causes of something is actually the end or goal, which doesn't exist until it's achieved in reality, but it does exist, at least in our minds, as the purpose that directs our actions.
So this is going to be a test question. I should just let you know. And it's an important introduction then to this piece, and then we'll find that Aristotle keeps building on this introduction. Did you have your hand up, Lloyd?
Yeah, I just had a question for Mike, and maybe you could elaborate this. I understand that how Aristotle uses the word good isn't quite the way that we use it today, and I was wondering if you could explain a little bit what he means with the word good.
That's a great question. The word good is going to be more similar to the word end or purpose or goal. And so good in this sense also has the connotations of being the purpose or goal of the action. So the highest good is the final cause, is the goal, is the purpose. And so it is not things that may be considered good in our sense, like ice cream. Might not be considered good in the Aristotelian sense because it brings harm with respect to physical, bodily problems if you eat too much of it. And so the sense of that we consider something good, which is that it might bring us pleasure, is going to be incorporated in Aristotle's sense at times, but the Aristotelian sense is much closer to this conception of end or purpose or goal, and good is almost synonymous in this case with it.
Is there another derivation on this as well? In one of my doctoral courses, we talked about the good as being what's best for the Greek city-state. What is the good, not for you personally, other than you should be a person who's always virtuous, and that makes up a good Greek city-state. But so we have two different notions going here?
This is a very difficult problem for me personally, and I think a careful reading of the Nicomachean Ethics will show this to be a difficulty. And this is a strategy that Aristotle uses when he writes. He'll raise problems at the beginning, and then these problems are serious because it looks like two contradictory answers both appear to be right, and he'll try to work out these difficulties throughout the text. What we see in this case with respect to your particular question is there almost seem to be two goods that human beings can achieve. Your own personal good, your own maximum amount of happiness that is only good for you, and then the good for society. And Aristotle looks like he wavers back and forth. This book, the Nicomachean Ethics, is seeking the single highest good, and yet there are going to be many candidates for that good. Some get dismissed, but some don't. And it looks like the good for society is not dismissed, but neither is the individual good, and yet these are not the same thing.
Thank you.
And so I would say to try to put that together into some kind of coherent conclusion, it looks like you'll have primary and secondary goods, and Aristotle wants to sort of figure out what's the highest good, what other goods should we be after, and how can we get as many of them as possible. And so you want to ask yourself, is this a treatise about making a single individual as happy as they can possibly be, or is it a treatise about making a society as a whole as good as it can possibly be? And I suspect a careful reading will point you in both directions.
Okay,
That's what I imagine.
So we both got it there then. Well, let's pull up the next graphic, and could you read this one for us, Rhonda?
Yes, the science that encompasses the study of the good is politics. Politics legislates what people are to do and what they are not to do. Its end seems to embrace the ends of other sciences. Thus it follows that the end of politics is the good for man.
And so if you could just continue on.
For even if the good is the same for the individual and the state, the good for the state clearly is the greater and more perfect thing to attain and to safeguard. The attainment of the good for one man alone is, to be sure, a source of satisfaction, yet to secure it for a nation and for states is nobler and more divine.
And one last continuation.
In short, these are the aims of our investigation, which is in a sense an investigation of social and political matters.
Okay, thank you. So, Luke, you can see that what Rhonda just read is exactly what Michael just told us. So it followed up well. Any questions or comments that you'd like to add to this?
No, I think this is very interesting, though, this idea of kind of the state is more important, and you kind of see that in, Athenian democracy, the whole idea that living a public life, being a public servant is the most important thing you could be doing, is really interesting. And the way that they would run for office, and they had it set up to where, it was a lottery to get elected, and everybody, you had to join, you had to enter the lottery, but you would enter and then they would pick people at random. So being involved in the state was part of your everyday life.
Luke is going to be leaving us pretty soon and going to Harvard for his graduate work, and we've loved having him as a Utah Valley State student. But do you think you're going to be studying all kinds of politics, including Aristotle's?
Oh yeah, yeah.
So this is a great place for you to always refer, I would think,
Yeah.
or often refer.
Yeah.
Okay.
The passage that Rhonda just read is one of the passages, as Luke pointed out, that really emphasizes this is a treatise not just about the individual, but about the state as a whole. Later, we'll see passages that make it sound much more like it's just about the individual.
Yeah,
This is Aristotle. Aristotle's going to hold these two contradictory claims together and say, look, they both seem to be true. The highest good is going to be a political matter, and yet happiness, which will be the highest good, as we'll see, is a very personal, individual matter. And so the job of the student of Aristotle is to say, well, how can we wed these two claims together to sort of preserve what's true in both of them? And there are ways, but I don't know if we'll get to them in this class.
We'll try. Rhonda?
I can see in these two paragraphs that I've read how governments, for the period of time of the world, have either interpreted this as, something good, and that they're limited, towards the people, or that they're so encompassing that it puts the people down, in the way for the greatest good.
I think that's the problem that Aristotle's looking at here is the good of society as a whole something that individuals must sacrifice to attain, and that's a problem he wants to work through. Exactly. I would like to make a point just tying these previous two graphics together.
Okay.
The key point to this analysis in Aristotle's conception of teleology, and if you read chapter 1 and chapter 2 of book 1 carefully, I believe students will see this, is that Aristotle actually sets up a hierarchy of goods. He's making an argument in these first few chapters, and he's trying to make the argument that there is in fact a single highest good that's probably the same for everybody insofar as they're a human being, and that we can achieve it. And so this first chapter makes the argument, he talks about things like military strategy, and he says, look, making a bridle is for the sake of horseback riding. You don't really need the bridle if you don't have a horse. But for Aristotle, horseback riding is primarily for military strategy. And so he actually says military strategy and its goals and purposes and ends are better than horseback riding, and horseback riding is better than bridle making because bridle making is for the sake of horseback riding is for the sake of military strategy. And so the art which lower arts, or what Aristotle calls subordinate arts, are directed towards are better and more important to be attained. The ends of the highest arts are better and more important to be attained than those of the subordinate arts. And so Aristotle argues that there's a single highest art that every other human activity is directed towards. That highest art, he says, is politics. So horseback riding, bridle making, military strategy, naval technology is all directed towards politics. Therefore, politics is the highest art. The goal of politics will be the highest good, and it's the purpose of this treatise first to argue that there is a highest good, and that's what chapter 1 makes the argument, and then to say that highest good is the goal of politics, which is the highest art, and then finally the rest of book 1 is meant to identify what is this highest good that politics aims to achieve for all of its citizens.
I think that this would be Luke's goal in life, to say, can't we move back to this ideal? Because you kind of look at the way Poles see politicians now, and it's, right under used car salesman, not to put down used car salesmen, but, or politicians. But the public opinion polls just aren't very favorable. And I think it's always been a concern of Luke ever since I've known him. And he'd love to see, the image kind of get cleaned up.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think there are a lot of lessons to learn from Aristotle and the other writers and Athenian democracy in general. Just the way they set it up to where people really wanted to be involved. That was their highest goal. And then they also created systems of fairness. You know, they didn't think it was right that the wealthiest person should always be elected to office. That's why they had the lottery. And when it came to other matters, when there was a conflict of interest, they always tried to mitigate that to make it so that, you know, the good of the state was going to be achieved, rather than somebody's personal agenda.
Thank you.
Plato in the Republic, actually, which is basically we should treat as a work of literature, not necessarily a direct program for a political society. But he does argue in the Republic that one of the fundamental requirements for the ruler of society is that they don't want to rule, and that if you want to rule, there are going to be selfish motives, and you will necessarily lead to a bad civilization if your rulers desire to rule. And so Plato says the people who least desire to rule must be forced to rule, and if you don't have that, you can't have a good society, he argues.
I've always liked that argument. The I wish we could do the Republic in this course.
And it's probably reflected in the aspect of Greek democracy that Luke was talking about, in which people are not elected to office but chosen by lottery, to be sure that there is no campaigning or anything like that. That couldn't happen in at least Athenian democracy.
Wonderful discussion. Let's go ahead and move on to our next graphic and see how this opens up into our reading then. And would you read this for us, Erin?
Sure. 3 kinds of life: contemplative life, political life, cultivated, educated, seeks honor, even excellence; pleasure seekers, who are vulgar and uneducated.
Okay, and Luke, do you want to tell us a little bit about that, or Lloyd?
Go ahead,
We'll go with Lloyd.
Okay, then.
I've been talking a lot.
Well, basically, what Aristotle's doing here is he's talking about what the title says, 3 kinds of life. And so he's pointing at, he's saying, okay, there's 3 different ways that people live. And in a certain sense, there's 3 different kinds of goods that people are seeking after. There's the contemplative life, which we'll talk about, is more like the intellectual life, the life of thought and everything. And then you have the political life, which is with those who seek power and authority and everything. And then finally you have the pleasure seekers. Those are those whose the aim that they're going after, the good they're going after, is just what makes them feel good inside. And that's what he calls the vulgar, because they're just above animals, basically.
Uh-huh. Would you like to add to this, Erin, Luke, Rhonda?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think I'm right on this, that the word idiot comes from the Greek word for somebody who was kind of the third one here, a pleasure seeker.
We'll ask our philologist here.
Who was focused on their personal aims rather than the state, the greater good. And I also think it's interesting that he talks a little bit about those who seek the political life. They're anxious to stop studying and start acting, and they're a little too ambitious and they're in too much of a hurry, and they're kind of missing the point, is his argument.
Thank you. So, idiot?
I must confess to not being familiar with the origins of the word idiot.
I could be totally
I certainly trust you. My memory of this passage is that pleasure seeker here comes from our word hedonism. And so I believe that pleasure in this passage is hedone, where we get the word hedonism, which means desiring physical, bodily pleasure above all else. But we would have to check the original text, I think, to be certain about that.
Well, we'll check it out. But I do like these questions. They're the kind of questions that come up in class, and often I'll have to tell my students, I don't know, but I'll tell you next time. So that's what we'll have to say on this one. We'll tell you next time.
But what I can say about this, these 3 kinds of lives are very important to Aristotle. And this is a good, I think, access into the Nicomachean ethics. What Aristotle's doing here, he's decided there is a single highest good. That's what the first few chapters argue, that there's a highest good that human beings can attain in their lives, and that everything we do is basically directed towards this highest good. What he does next is he goes to what are widely considered by the people of his time, what we would call the reputable opinions of his own time, to be the highest good that people can achieve in life. And those goods are contemplation or philosophical knowledge, pleasure of some kind, physical pleasure, and possibly honor or some other good that would be associated with the political life. And if you read carefully, he will go through these arguments and he will say, look, let's take the life of pleasure. It's just too vulgar, as Lloyd pointed out. It's not a human good. That's something that animals, other than human beings, desire. So it can't be the good we're looking for because we share it with these vulgar beasts. He'll also look at wealth, which most of the people who would seek pleasure as the highest good would desire above all else in his own time. They would seek wealth to be able to acquire their pleasures. And he argues wealth is only good for what you can do with it. It's never good for its own sake. And so the highest good is good always, he'll say, for its own sake, never for what you can do with it. So you always want money so you can buy something else. Because money is never desired just to have it on its own, it can't be the highest good, and he just dismisses it immediately. Honor, with respect to the political life, he will dismiss, because honor depends not on you, but on what other people think about you. And so he finds it too fickle to really be the highest good. But he does say honor or excellence will be the goal of the political life. And that little or is actually saying maybe honor, but no, honor's wrong. Excellence will turn out to be the goal of the political life, and excellence is going to translate the same word that translates virtue in this case. And so with those three lives, Aristotle looks at the political life and the contemplative life. Neither one winds up getting dismissed, and they both figure into his highest good ultimately farther along into the book.
Okay, thank you. And if we could turn to page 46, and Rhonda, on the bottom of page 46, paragraph number 7, could you read that for us, please?
Sure. Let us again return to the good we are seeking and ask what it can be. It seems different in different actions in art. It is different in medicine, in strategy, and in the other arts likewise. When then is the good of each? Surely that those whose sake everything else is done. In medicine this is health, in strategy victory, in architecture a house, in any other sphere something else, and in every action and pursuit the end. For it is the sake of this that all men do whatever else they do. Therefore, if there is an end for all that we do, this will be the good achievable by action. And if there are more than one, these will be the goods achievable by action. So the argument...
And that's just fine right there, and appreciate that. And we'll see how it ties in then to what Dr. Shaw's been talking about. Aaron, I think you had a comment that you'd like to make, and hopefully it'll tie in also with where we've just moved.
I kind of wanted to ask Mike or Dr. Shaw about...
Mike is okay.
Okay, thanks. About this is when you were describing these other ends and things being best for themselves, is this the part where we're talking about final and self-sufficient?
Next paragraph.
Because we're
exactly
using those words in a kind of different way, you can tell from the text, then I think we would say, well, and that was the final scene. You know, it's a little bit different than that, and we're not talking about self-sufficient in the sense that I can do it all on my own, but in the sense that this abstract concept is self-sufficient, not dependent, like he said, wealth or honor. Honor's dependent on those other people thinking something good about you, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So honor is not self-sufficient because you need other people to honor you. You can't have honor by yourself, so honor isn't self-sufficient, but the highest good is something that if you have it, you've got it. You don't need anything else. And that's the sense of self-sufficiency. Once you get it, you don't need anything else to add to it to make it better. Like an ice cream, going back to the ice cream example, an ice cream sundae could be made better by chocolate sauce. So would that be true, ice cream cannot be said to be self-sufficient. But in the same way, the better example is honor is not self-sufficient because I need you to honor me. And if I don't have you, I can't have honor by myself. To be final, in this sense, means it goes back to that idea of the hierarchy of ends. And so that if wealth is a great example of something that's never final, wealth, you always need what you can buy with that wealth. And so it's never final on its own, but its good is only brought into existence really by what you can do with it. But a final good means that it's not directed towards anything further.
So, Aaron, let me have you read on page 47, very first paragraph, and it's the last sentence of that first paragraph, happiness then.
Happiness then is something final and self-sufficient and is the end of action.
Okay, so here we're going to find something that is then, he's going to say, both final and self-sufficient. And so he's given us a very good explanation, and I think Mike has given us just an outstanding explanation of final and self-sufficient, but now he's saying do you want a good life? Well, a good life means you're going to find those things that make you happy. And if we look back at these three characteristics, the pleasurable life is not going to make you happy. You're going to have to start looking at some other areas. Anything you'd like to add to that?
Sure. Happiness is a great example to understand what Aristotle means by final and self-sufficient, because you can see why happiness is both of these things. And Aristotle's really appealing to the obvious at this point, and he knows that. And so the idea is that happiness is self-sufficient, because if you have perfect happiness, do you need anything else? And Aristotle says no. If you have perfect happiness, you got to have everything you need right there, because what we want is happiness. And it's final because you don't ever say, I want to be happy so that I can get a big car. You say, I want a big car, or whatever, we're back to that wealth example, or I want a good job, or whatever it is, so that I can be happy. And so the things are always directed towards happiness. Happiness is never desired for something further. And that's the sense in which happiness is final and also self-sufficient.
Thank you. Oh, there are so many fun points with this, but I think I'm going to go ahead and move on into the point about function and have Lloyd tell us just a little bit about function from page 47 and what we would be doing as far as our functions in life.
Well, I think that's in a way related to what Aaron was talking about earlier with Aristotle having his zoo and wanting to dissect things. And so as Aristotle, he was in a lot of ways is dissecting humanity and trying to figure out, okay, what are the purposes of each part of humanity. He looks at, okay, well, humans in general, there's professions where they have like flute players or someone who makes tables, and their function is to be able to play the flute the best, or be able to make the best table or whatever. And he also, looking at how the body works, he says, okay, well, the eyes have a function to see, and the fingers have functions to grab and to feel. And so he wants to say, okay, well, then do humans as a whole have, just not as a profession, but just as a human being, is there a function in that as well? Because for him, it seemed like everything else had a function. So he wants to ask, okay, do humans have functions as well then?
Absolutely correct. And he's going to move on to a beautiful quote on this on page 47, second column, and it's the very first quote. Would you mind reading that one for us as well, Aaron?
Since happiness?
But we must add, in a complete life.
At the very top.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yes. But we must add, in a complete life, for one swallow does not make a summer, nor does one day. And so too, one day or a short time does not make a man blessed and happy. Also, do you want me to continue?
Mm-hmm.
Also, a happy man needs the external goods as well, for it is impossible or not easy to do noble acts without the proper equipment. In many actions we use friends and riches and political power as instruments, and there are some things the lack of which takes the luster from happiness, as good birth, goodly children, beauty. For the man who is very ugly in appearance, or ill-born, or solitary and childless, is not very likely to be happy, and perhaps a man would be still less likely if he had thoroughly bad children or friends, or had lost good children or friends by death.
So we see here then these complicated notions, the first one of function, and the second one of saying happiness builds up. That I can't really say to you, Mike, are you a happy guy? Because you might say, well, I am to this point.
Right.
But it isn't until you've lived your whole life. Kind of like if you went to a football game and I ran into Rhonda at halftime and said, great game, huh? And she'd say, to this point. Meaning we haven't seen the whole game. We don't know if it's a great game or not. And
it helps if you win.
It helps if you win. But do you want to help us tie together these notions of function and a complete life?
I do. The idea of function, excuse me. The idea of function, Aristotle will trace that to trying to seek what is the function of a human being. And he will determine that just like the function of a flute player is to play the flute well, the function of a human being is quite simply to live well. And so he says, well, what is that by which we live? And he argues that it's the soul. And then he says, well, is the function of a human life going to be found in this part of the soul that Aristotle understands as being responsible for biological growth and ingestion of food and things like that? And he says, no, every living thing does that. Plants do that. There's going to be nothing big to human beings with that. And so he ultimately decides that that part of the human soul that makes us unique, which is, for Aristotle, the rational capacity within our souls, is what must be the special human function. And so to use the rational part of your soul well turns out to be the function of a human being, since the function of the human being turns out to be the good for a human being. And we already know from earlier that the good of the human being will be happiness. To have an excellently functioning rational soul it's not that it will bring you happiness, it's that for Aristotle, that's what happiness is. And so that's the beginning part, before the quote that Aaron read. And this is at the bottom of the first column on 47, the last 4 lines there. Aristotle says, human good turns out to be the activity of soul in accordance with virtue, and if there are more than one virtue, in accordance with the best and most complete. And so that's actually Aristotle's definition of happiness, is the activity of the human soul in accordance with virtue or excellence.
On page 47, second column, right next to 13, Rhonda, could you read that for us? And we'll try to tie this together and then move on to our moral virtues.
Sure. Since happiness is an activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue, we must consider the nature of virtue, for perhaps we shall thus see better the nature of happiness.
Okay. Is this all fitting in nice and tidy for you, Aaron?
Well, it would, except for it seemed like in the passage we read just a moment ago at the top of 47, just before Rhonda's at 13, Aristotle's kind of snuck back in all the external goods that he says, that he talks about the end is happiness, and happiness is just this kind of virtue that Mike defined, and then suddenly he says, and all that other stuff.
Okay, Mike, and all that other stuff.
Well, I think he decides that happiness is just this activity of soul in accordance with perfect virtue. But he's a realist as well. And he says, look, you could have the greatest soul ever, but if the plague comes to your town, happiness isn't really going to be there for you quite as well. And so he says, look, here's what's in our control, and this is what happiness is. But then there are all of these external factors that realistically do involve, are involved with you attaining complete happiness. We've skipped chapters 8 through 12. And in this reading, in chapters 8 through 12, Aristotle will draw a distinction, as he loves to do, between sort of a blessed life and a happy life. And so he's going to say, look, happiness is just this activity of soul in accordance with virtue. If you aren't well born, if you aren't beautiful, if you aren't other very shallow things that we may consider today, Aristotle's going to say you're probably not going to be in a position even to achieve that excellent soul. You've got to be well born, have good political connections, be an attractive, successful person, just to get the kind of education you need to get this happiness. And so there's a very close connection between Aristotle's soul and body. They're not distinct. We can't go into that. But if you have sort of a deformed body, he might think you have some kind of deformed soul. So that on the one hand, there are all these things you need in order just to be able to achieve a happy soul. But then you can have all of these great things, but meet misfortune later in your life. In that case, he will say that if you are virtuous, you will bear misfortune better than those who are not.
Can I react to his response
quickly?
Okay. Number one, doesn't that mean that
it's start out with number one? No, go ahead.
There are only two. Number one, doesn't that mean that hardly anyone's going to be happy?
Absolutely.
And number two, isn't that a dig at Socrates because he was reportedly very ugly?
Well, the relationship to Socrates is a great problem, and I think maybe it is. And so, for your starting with your second question, Socrates is well known to have been ugly. He was also poor. And so, is this a dig at Socrates? Quite possibly. Is Socrates some kind of weird anomaly or exception to Aristotle's conception? Possibly. With respect to your first question, Aristotle's ethics, it's probably very unlikely that a majority of people attain perfect happiness. What we will see very quickly is that Aristotle is going to conceive of different kinds of virtues, and you kind of need them all because happiness is the activity of soul in accordance with virtue. Aristotle is going to divide the soul up into several parts. Each part gets its own virtue. Moral virtue is what we'll be talking about briefly here, and that is something that most people can achieve at least a little bit, and therefore can get some happiness out of that. The intellectual virtues, which we don't cover in this class, are much more difficult to attain. Not very many people get them, and so, but they are really what's required for complete happiness, so it's rare. And for Aristotle, that makes it even better. If it's hard to get, then it's got to be good.
Thank you for that.
Yes, thank you. And let's go ahead and talk about these next two on the slide. And Luke, would you read these for us?
Yes.
Two kinds of virtue.
Two kinds of virtue. Intellectual virtue is taught, requires time and experience. Moral value caused by habit.
Moral virtue then is caused by habit. And let's continue on and have you read the next slide as well.
Virtue, as we have seen, consists of two kinds, intellectual virtue and moral virtue. Intellectual virtue, or excellence, owes its origin and development chiefly to teaching, and for that reason requires experience and time. Moral virtue, on the other hand, is formed by habit. This shows, too, that none of the moral virtues is implanted in us by nature, for nothing which exists by nature can be changed by habit.
Okay, so with our moral and intellectual virtues, we see that Aristotle takes another dig at Plato. We know that one of the big rifts between them, where Aristotle says something akin to, dear is Plato, but dear still is truth. And he doesn't think that we innately have these anything. We have to learn it all by habit. So do you want to tell us a little bit about this distinction and the test question that the students will need to answer on moral virtue and intellectual virtue?
Yes, intellectual virtue is the subject of Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics. So our reading doesn't contain very much about it, except for just a few details where Aristotle introduces it. Intellectual virtue, it's going to turn out there are two kinds. There's practical wisdom and there's philosophical wisdom. Moral virtue is directly linked to practical wisdom. Practical wisdom, it's a complicated concept, but it means being able to sort of go into a political environment, deal with all of the factors, and reason towards the best course of action. That's what the person with practical wisdom will be able to do. And for Aristotle, if you don't have moral virtue, you can't have practical wisdom. So moral virtue is required. It's a prerequisite for practical wisdom. Philosophical wisdom, the other intellectual virtue, is mathematical and scientific contemplation. You never do anything with it. For Aristotle, it only contemplates eternal truths, and it's actually not tied to moral virtue. So you can have this philosophical wisdom and be kind of, maybe a creepy character, but to have practical wisdom, you've got to be just an outstanding citizen in every aspect of your life. So you cannot be a good political leader for Aristotle if you do not have perfect moral virtue, and then that brings us to the question of what moral virtue is.
It does, and maybe gives us some helps. Lloyd, whenever you're talking with friends or other students about the golden mean or Aristotle's mean, tell me a little bit about, in your own words, how you explain it.
Yeah, all the times when I'm talking with my friends about the golden mean.
At all those parties you go to.
Basically, the golden mean is, with virtues, there's contrasts of where, you could be really courageous, or you could be a coward, or you could be, there's always contrasts in all the different ways we act in the world. And the golden mean is the best place to be between those. And it doesn't mean it's right dead in the middle, because it might be better to be more courageous, to lean more towards the courageous side than the cowardice side, or whatever. So it depends on where you're at, because if you're too courageous, you might be crazy, you might be jumping off cliffs and stuff and killing yourself. And so, but if you're too much of a coward, then you get beat up all the time, you can't exist. And so the golden mean isn't the middle, but it's the best place in between those two.
Thank you. And you'll notice, good explanation, page 49, first column, bottom paragraph starts out, virtue then is a state of character concerned with choice lying in a mean, i.e. the mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle which the man of practical wisdom, so here we're back to practical wisdom, would determine it. Now it is a mean between two vices, that which depends on excess and that which depends on defect. So tell us a little bit about this golden mean. And I know we don't have much time left.
So
but
we'll pack a lot in at the end here.
Yes, we will.
Okay, so Aristotle's going to conceive of the human soul as having distinct passions. We have anger, and anger is something really that's in our soul. We have love, we have fear, we have confidence, we have physical desires for pleasure, we have desires for money. Any emotion or passion that the human soul has can be felt well or poorly. For Aristotle, the first kind of virtue, which is moral virtue, is to feel these passions well. This arises by habituating yourself. And so you're not taught that courage is acting this way in this situation, acting this way in that situation. And so it's not like an actual test where you just have to learn what it is. You must live it, and that's what it means to be habituated. You must be forced to act courageously in a dangerous situation. And Aristotle believes the more times you act courageously, eventually you will actually make your soul habituated to be courageous on its own. So the first few battles, you got to be pushed into the front so that you don't run away. After time, you naturally stay and fight, and it actually brings you pleasure. So what Aristotle thinks is that we have these passions in our soul. Each one can be felt excessively or deficiently or just right. And that's what the golden mean is. Virtue means to feel each passion according to the perfect mean for yourself, what the moderate amount of this passion would be, and to feel that way naturally. So that's not to say that you're born with it, but that you habituate your soul to feel these virtues towards the mean on their own, and it just becomes a state of your character. Once you feel all of these virtues perfectly towards the mean, which means when you're confronted with a situation, your desire is for the mean. If you're confronted with the opportunity for physical pleasure, you don't desire too little, you don't desire too much, you desire just the mean amount of it, and that's what is the first step towards bringing you happiness. And the only other catch there is that to feel these passions virtuously, you don't have courage because you think that it's necessary or it will be good for you. You actually take pleasure in feeling the mean, and that's when you know you have the virtuous mean, is when acting towards the mean brings you pleasure.
Oh, brilliant. Brilliant wrap up to this class. Thank you, Michael. It's been so wonderful having you here with us.
Thank you.
And thanks to you students. This has been a very good discussion on Aristotle, and we'll now move forward to a discussion on Carol Gilligan. Thank you. Bye-bye.